My name is Elizabeth Renfro, and I am the Family Consumer Science Extension Agent for UT Extension, Washington County. And with me, I have Adam Watson. He is one of our ag agents in the office at UT Extension, Washington County, and one of his main areas that he covers is horticulture. And so this evening, we are going to be talking about Herb Thyme, Garden to Table. So just a few things to get us started. Please be sure your microphone is on mute. If you can, please hold all questions till the end of the presentation. You can ask questions in the chat box, and we'll be able to answer them at the end. So we'll be kind of checking those throughout the presentation. Of course, the session will be recorded and then also be shared on YouTube, so you can go back and you can refer to anything that we have shared with you all this evening. And then also you can visit our YouTube channel, which is UT Extension, Washington County. And then of course, just a disclaimer, this information within this class is for educational purposes only. Reference to commercial products or trade names does not imply endorsement by UT Extension or bias against those not mentioned. So I'm going to hand over the presentation to Adam. He's going to get us started this evening.
All righty, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. All right, we'll give it a second to load. All right. So to begin with, let me thank you for joining us this evening. See some faces from some other webinars we've done, so we're happy to have you back. And I think we also have some new folks, so that's good too. So luckily, I get to cover the gardening side of our herb talk tonight, which is good because that's what I know about. And so, you know, this first slide to start out, I sort of thought about it. And I thought, you know, what is an herb garden? And in all honesty, I don't think there's one answer to it. And that's why we have kind of a jumble of pictures up there on that screen. You know, herb gardens can be very formal, particularly if we look to European examples and things of that nature. We can find where they're part of knot gardens and things of that sort, where it's a very formal garden. We can look to where, you know, they're a focal point maybe as a planter in a garden. Sometimes they're just mixed in with vegetables, and sometimes they're just out on our balconies or on a patio because that's the only space that an individual has. So I think with herb gardens, I think they're very flexible. And I think that's good because it allows everybody to come to it, no matter what situation they may be in when it comes to gardening space or experience. So if we want to ask what is an herb, I found one quote I really liked. This question was posed to King Charlemagne, and he said that an herb was the friend of physicians and the praise of cooks. So we're definitely going to be focusing on the praise of cooks portion tonight. And Merriam-Webster defines it as a plant or plant part valued for its medicinal, savory, or aromatic qualities. So again, we're going to be talking about the culinary aspects of herbs this evening, but certainly herbs are versatile. So they, you know, historically they have been used medicinally. Certainly they have qualities such as their aromatic nature that lends them to be used in a number of different ways, and also just from an aesthetic standpoint as well. There's a lot of herbs that are actually neat looking plants. They work great in the landscape because it will be a texture or a color or a structure that maybe is different from some ornamentals. So simply because ornamentation may not be our first thought with an herb doesn't mean they can't be used in that fashion. So our talk tonight is going to be pretty basic. So we're going to cover some basic things. For some of you on here, this may be something you already know very well, but for a beginner, we're hoping that this will be a good stepping stone. So, you know, real quickly, when we talk about herbs, we can really find three life cycles that are present within herb species. So there's annuals, which complete the life cycle in a single growing season, perennials that live for more than one growing season, and then biennials, which require 2 growing seasons to complete the life cycle. Now, the complicating thing is there are some perennials that we end up growing and using like annuals because, for instance, in our climate, they would die over winter. We're too cold. They're called tender perennials. So sometimes a perennial is treated like an annual. Biennials, in the same way, there are some biennials that either wouldn't overwinter, or maybe we're not worried about the second portion of their life cycle where they'd go to seed. Maybe we're only worried about harvesting their growth that first cycle. And so sometimes we treat biennials as annuals as well. But do be aware that we do have those three types of life cycles, and it does, in some ways change our management of the plant depending which category it would fit into. If you're just getting started with herbs, growing from seed can be a great way to do it. One of the biggest reasons is it's easy to be successful with herbs from seed. There's a number of them that will start readily, don't require any sort of special care. I always encourage people to, read the seed packet. Most often that seed packet will have the information you need to be successful with that seed. So for instance, there are some herb seeds that need light to actually germinate, so we wouldn't want to cover those deeply. And in fact, if there was one mistake that we see novice gardeners making when it comes to starting from seed, is they bury the seed too deeply. A general rule is never plant a seed deeper than 2 to 3 times the width of the seed. And especially when you start looking at some of the herbs, we're talking about very small seeds. So a very light covering is what's called for. Like most seeds, they're going to germinate best in warm temperatures where the temperature is at least 70 degrees. And don't overwater. Start them out in a small container and just water enough to wet the surface well, and then increase watering as they grow. We do need a lead time about 4 to 6 weeks to grow most transplants ready for the garden from seed. And so that may limit at this juncture of the gardening season whether or not we start from seed. There are some herbs that we can actually grow very readily from cuttings, especially those within the mint family, things like lemon verbena, mints of all kinds, as well as sages. They root readily, and so it's a great way to share an herb plant if you have a friend that has one. And with some species, it can be more difficult than like with the mint family. And so timing may be important, especially when we look at woody species. Some will root better if we take them during the dormant season rather than the growing season. And for some, it would be exactly the opposite. We can use rooting powders. Rooting powders are a hormone that encourages root formation. And so those can be useful if we're trying to propagate, especially some of those more difficult to root herbs. And purchase plants are another great way to start with if you're a novice, or if it's kind of like this season where it's already got a start and we want to jump right in. It's really good because some of those more difficult to propagate plants, whether from seed or cuttings, it's already done by the professionals. And so you're able to take advantage of that and have a great plant ready to go out into the landscape. We do want to pay attention to the quality of the plants whenever we're buying them. So look for plants with healthy foliage. I like this picture because it shows you not every color of green means that a plant's in trouble. So sometimes we think of dark green as being a healthy plant, but if you look over the palette of colors, when you look at all the different sorts of herbs, just because it's a light of green doesn't mean the plant's in trouble. So, does it look healthy? Does it have new growth happening? And does it have healthy roots? To me, when you're picking plants, whether it's a transplant or a tree or anything container grown, we really want to pay attention to the roots if we've got the option. And so if we can pop that plant out of its container, and you can do so without being destructive, you just have to take a moment and be deliberate with it. But what we want to see are white roots. And someone's going to notice that's not an herb, that's a marigold. I would counter that since we can eat marigold flowers, it is an herb. But maybe that's not worth arguing about. But it's actually what I had available to me to take a picture of healthy roots. So that's why it's in here. But, this is a good example. White roots all over the whole root mass media. They're not root bound. They're not, overly grown. But even with this, I'd kind of fluff those roots out whenever I go to plant it. And whenever we have a transplant, we do want to plant it at the same depth that it was growing in the container. We don't want to bury it deeper. For the vast majority of plants, that would actually be a problem because those roots need access to air, and we don't want to be covering up their stems with dirt. That can lead to opportunities for disease or insects to take advantage. So we wouldn't want to bury it any deeper. And of course, if we did have a plant that was very root bound, matted roots, we might actually have to not just kind of frizz the roots out, but actually cut them. So there's a number of times I've had to actually take a knife and cut matted roots, and plants respond well to that. We don't want to put a root bound plant into our garden or into a container. We want to encourage them to form new roots that are not encircling and entangled. General growing, and this pretty much goes for almost every herb, and so that sometimes can be a challenge depending on our landscape, but we need full sun, 6+ hours, and we want a well-drained site. We don't want it to hold water. Good drainage is essential. A lot of herbs, especially those that are from Mediterranean regions, they're actually from hotter, more arid parts of the world than what our climate represents. And so if we have them in a heavy soil that retains a lot of water, we're going to have a lot of dead roots and we're going to have a lot of root diseases. Another thing to pay attention to is the fertility levels. We're not looking to really push these herbs. There aren't really any herbs that we would call heavy feeders the way we might some vegetable plants. And so a very moderate level of fertility is generally good. We don't want to try to push them. So this is where using compost or other slow release fertilizers can be good rather than trying to push them with water soluble fertilizers or things like that. So allow these plants to grow slowly and establish, and generally you'll be surprised how well they perform with a very modest level of fertility. We can grow a lot of herbs in containers. We do want to pay attention to the size of that container. Typically, when we look at potting things up, we don't want to go more than 2 inches larger in diameter than the root ball we start with, because what happens when we put a small plant in a large pot, it can be waterlogged and we can have a lot of root diseases. We also want to make sure whatever pot or container we're using actually has good drainage, has drainage holes. Clay pots are really good for herbs, and sometimes clay pots can be a challenge for some plants whenever we are using them as containers because they dry out so quickly. But again, with herbs, a lot of these are looking for a very free draining media. They don't want to be sitting in water, so a pot that dries out a little bit faster is really a good answer to a problem. If we're talking about the potting media, the potting soil, we want to use a quality one, but you may have to amend it to get it as free draining as you would like. So don't be afraid to add amendments like perlite or calcined clay. This is clay that's been heated to a high temperature, so it almost looks like little rocks. And it allows the soil to be more free draining. The one thing I do want to caution you about is not to put gravel in the bottom of a pot. Putting gravel in the bottom of the pot is just removing volume from it because the way water flows when it's basically interacting different surfaces with different pore size. So if we put gravel in there, it doesn't make the drainage better. We've just reduced the volume of that pot and actually kind of moved the wettest layer up closer to the roots. So it actually creates somewhat of a perched water table. So now if we have a container that we think we need to weigh down the bottom because we have a top heavy plant, which is a possibility, then we'd want to make sure that we have enough room left over after adding that weighted material in the bottom. But just be aware that by putting a gravel layer in the bottom, we're not increasing drainage and actually leads to more problems. If we are growing, especially something that we're keeping as a perennial or at least bringing inside and keeping it longer, if we're not just using it as an annual, we want to pay attention to salt buildup within the soils. We can see kind of white crusting happening on the surface of containers. That's a good clue that this is something we need to do. The way you flush a pot to remove those soluble salts is to water the plant as you would normal, and then pour a water volume equal to that of the pot through it. And of course, don't let the pot sit there in that water that's draining out ever, but certainly not in this consideration when we're removing those salts. And we want to do this when it's warm and sunny weather expected. We don't want to super water a plant and then have it sit there wet and cold for several days. And what this does is this removes those salts that dissolve into the water and then are removed from the pot. Lots of times in the season, this isn't a problem, especially if we have pretty normal periods of rain, because a large rain event can do this for you. So it is something to be aware of. Watch your pots, and if you see that white layer building up, it's a good clue we need to go ahead and do that. A few other just kind of general tips. In very poor soils, use organic amendments. And what I mean, things like compost, they improve fertility, which again, we do want decent fertility. So it's not a bad ideal to use those sorts of amendments, but it also improves drainage. So if you have something like heavy clay, adding compost to it is an excellent start to getting it heading in the right direction. Another thing I'd encourage you to use is mulches with your herbs. When you use 2 to 4 inches of organic mulch, and it could be anything from wood chips to straw or any other organic materials, what we do is, one, we reduce the water frequency, and it also helps to maintain the amount of water in the soil. It evaporates less quickly. We reduce competition from weeds, which makes it easier. But another thing is it keeps the plants cleaner. And so especially when it comes to harvesting a lot of these herbs that are sort of lower to the ground, if we have a lot of rain, we're going to have a lot of splash happening, and that puts a lot of soil and dirt up there. So having a good organic good organic mulch down can help reduce the amount of dirt that is coming onto those plants. One thing to mention, some plants such as mints can be very aggressive growers in the garden. And so they can overrun an area in short order. So especially with mints in particular, you may want to plant those in a pot in the ground because they do spread and they will do so willingly. And that can be great because they can fill in areas maybe where you have a bare spot or you've had trouble getting certain plants to flourish. Maybe you need that there. But just be aware that mints can run amok. And so sometimes it's easier to plant ahead and plant them in that pot so they don't overtake an area. Very few other just points I'd like to make before we get into some specifics. Cutting back or harvesting of our herbs actually encourages them to grow more. So we'll actually see more branching and thus more growth from most of our herbs whenever we actually are harvesting. So, harvesting your plants even when they're small is okay. We just need to leave enough for regrowth. In general, when we remove the flowers, we're also promoting vegetative growth. So plants are essentially programmed to grow, to flower and set seed. And so once they start setting seed, a lot of plants say, okay, I'm done, because they have accomplished their goal. So as we remove those flowers, it basically kickstarts them back into that vegetative growth to say, wait a second, I need to keep growing, I need to produce flowers. So remove those flowers and we encourage more growth. Perennials that we may overwinter, this more or less is kind of the best time of year to cut them back. We don't want to cut them back when we still have frost events likely, because it will encourage growth. And so we don't want to cut them back, let's say 1st of April, and then we have a late freeze or frost and we lose that new growth. So cutting them back about this time of year is perfect. And again, what that does is those plants become woody, they have less vegetative growth. By cutting them back, they'll regrow with more vegetation. I'll also mention that we have the opportunity to provide host plants for butterflies, and that's a fancy way of saying dinner for the caterpillars. So we have dill, fennel, flatleaf parsley, as opposed to some of the other types, which we'll talk about, as well as rue, are all butterfly host plants. And of course, there's any number of herbs in the garden that act as nectar plants for not just butterflies, but also other insects in our garden. So, starting out, we'll talk a few specifics about some annuals. Basil, very common herb, maybe one of the most popular, if not the most popular. It is from the mint family, which is good. Most of the mint family are vigorous growers. Basil does not take over, so we don't have to worry about that. But basil is definitely a plant that can do well. There are many types of basil, as many as you can think of, and then you'll find a few more. So there's different scented ones, such as lemon. There's different colors. There's ones that are stronger in flavor, some that have enormous leaf size, others that are very small. So just a whole variety of possibilities with basil. Again, general terms: full sun, well-drained soil, not picky at all when it comes to fertility. And we do want to make sure we're pulling out those flower stalks to promote vegetative growth as they grow in the garden. Parsley is a member of the carrot family, and there's actually 3 types of parsley, and 2 of them are represented in this picture. And let me bring up the pointer. This one here with the very simple flat leaf is flat leaf parsley, sometimes called Italian parsley. The one beside it with the more curled leaf is either curled parsley or French is another designation for it. And there's actually a 3rd type of parsley. It's called root parsley or parsley root. Now, when we think about it, it's in the carrot family, and so root parsley will actually grow a root that kind of looks like a white carrot. Oddly enough, it doesn't really taste like carrots or parsley. It's said to taste more like celery. So that's another possibility. But again, from a butterfly standpoint, flat leaf or Italian parsley is supposed to be more attractive to butterfly caterpillars or butterflies where they lay their eggs. And also flat leaf is generally considered to have the stronger flavor. The root parsley is not considered a good flavor, the foliage on it. It's considered to be more bitter, and you really grow it for the root, not for the leaves. So one thing to mention about parsley, if you do grow it from seed, it can be very slow to germinate, 4 to 6 weeks on germination. So be aware of that. This may be one that it's better off to purchase it depending on your timeline. If you are harvesting it, you cut the outside leaf stalks close to the ground and allow the inner new growth to continue to grow, and you will be able to keep harvesting over a longer period of time versus coming in just cutting it all down to the ground. So again, harvest the older ones as they mature and let those center ones continue to grow. This one's a neat one because it's kind of a 2-for-1 for us. So coriander. But we also know it as cilantro. So what's the difference? So cilantro are the young leaves of this plant. And so if we're growing it for cilantro, we're looking to have a number of plants planted multiple times over the season. In fact, if we plant this, about this time of year, as the summer warms up, it will actually start flowering. And then, of course, from the seeds is where we get the coriander. So this is kind of 2-for-1, although it is recommended that if you're looking to do coriander production, you're going to plant a number of plants because there's actually very few seed per plant that is produced. So with cilantro, it's a little bit more forgiving. Fewer plants are required, but with coriander to the seed, you do want to have more plants. And just to show you what it looks like when it's flowering and what it looks like the seed capsule, the fruit where the seed's actually contained. And so again, it's another plant that when it's in flower, there's any number of pollinators that'll be interested in it. And so this is one kind of 2-for-1. You can find references to where it will self-sow even in the same season, but probably if I did want to have a later fall crop of it, I'd make a point to either seed it myself or start it and transplant it out just to be sure of that. So on to some perennials that are common in our garden. So chives. Chives are part of the onion family, and they're actually the smallest member. So we have 2 main types. There's kind of the common chives that has a mild onion flavor. What's distinct about it is it has round hollow stems, and then there's garlic chives, of course, with a mild garlic flavor to them. Those actually are flat stems, so it's easy to tell the 2 apart. Growth requirements we see again are the same: full sun, well-drained soil, not picky about fertility. These will self-seed in the garden. So if you have them in an area and you're happy with the number you have there, you're going to want to cut off those blooms and not allow them to set seed. The good thing is those blooms are edible. So it is something that we can use from a culinary standpoint. The other thing that's recommended is lots of times after these plants are in an area for several years, 3 years or so, it's recommended that they be moved, because sometimes we can see decline of these plants when they're left in spot year after year after year. So it is something to be aware of, that by moving them to a new location can encourage their growth. Oregano is another perennial in our garden. So this is one that the seeds do require light to germinate. So we want to cover them very lightly whenever we are starting transplants. Growth requirements we've seen before: full sun, well drained, likes low fertility. Again, we're not trying to push this plant. We're letting it grow as it will. We do want to remove those flowers as they form, because that will keep it in vegetative growth. You're starting to see a lot of commonalities, and part of that is a lot of these plants are coming from the mint family, which does have shared characteristics. Rosemary, this is one that I don't think we can say it reliably overwinters in our area. Now, especially this past winter, I'd say that a lot of rosemary left out in the garden did survive. We actually have rosemary out front of our office. It survived no problem, but our office also has a lot of brick and stone on the front of it, and these are planted right in the midst of it, so it's kind of in the middle of a heat sink. So our plants surviving, it's not really a good indicator whether or not something survives in our area. So a lot of people do treat this as a tender perennial. So that either means accepting that they're going to have to replant it next year, and maybe in a certain winter getting a good lucky surprise that it overwinters, or bring it in indoors. So you'll see a lot of rosemary that is grown in a container, in a pot, and folks bring it in and overwinter it. Again, similar growth requirements. Rosemary can be very tolerant to drought. That's not to say drought proof. So if you do have it out in the garden and it is a very long drought period, you will want to irrigate it, give it some water. It will benefit from it, but it is one that can be pretty resilient. An interesting thing about rosemary is it can be pruned or grown into shapes with topiary. So it's something that can add a little bit of ornamentation to the garden. And so it's definitely one that's a little bit different, being a perennial. And this is one that sometimes as it gets more woody, we would want to look at cutting it back as the growing season begins about this time of year, if we do have some that we're overwintering. As they become more woody, they will produce less vegetation. Sage, again, similar growth habits and requirements that we see: full sun, well-drained soils. It's somewhat drought tolerant, probably a little bit less maybe than rosemary, but again, pretty resilient plant. These do get woody. These do reliably overwinter. So typically we would expect that sage will overwinter well in our area, but we do again want to pay attention to that rejuvenation pruning about this time of year. So lastly, I wanted to leave y'all with a resource you can look back to that one will not only cover these plants, but also others. And so you see the link there on your screen, tiny.utk.edu/herbgarden. It's actually going to take you to a publication from the University of Kentucky. This was, I feel, one of the better publications out there. I looked at several. One good thing about looking at a more northern source of information, such as Kentucky, if it talks about something being hardy, we can be pretty sure of it. Our area, although we are more, we have more severe winters than say the western part of our state, anything that is hardy in Kentucky should be hardy in our area, even in the eastern part of the state. We have a very similar climate overall, so I often find that Kentucky has good information that matches up well with our immediate growing area. So I think you'll find that useful. And with that, I am finished with my presentation. Let me end the slideshow here. And Elizabeth, did you want to see about any questions at this point, or wait until you're finished with your section?
No, we can see if there's any questions.
Okay.
One question that came through, but I think you answered it during the presentation, is why no gravel?
Okay, yeah. So what happens is the thought process is, okay, gravel is very free draining. But what happens is how water moves through the soil and soil particles. So when we have two drastically different pore sizes or space in between the particles, you have to completely saturate the first one, the smaller particle holes, until it moves into the larger. And so what happens by having a distinct barrier, a distinct boundary, you don't improve the water flow because it doesn't flow out of the potting soil until it's completely saturated. And so all you do is you reduce the volume of soil in that pot. Now, again, there are times when that may be needed because of top-heavy plants and things of that nature, but then we want to make sure we size up that pot, that container, to allow for that loss of soil. So again, when we don't have the full volume of that plant soil there, we're actually moving the wettest layers, which are on the bottom of the pot, closer to the root ball. And again, a saturated root ball doesn't have oxygen in it, and that lack of oxygen can kill roots directly, as well as set up conditions for any number of root diseases.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions for now. Adam,
Okay.
do you have any more for Adam? Of course, he'll be with us this evening. So yes, Mary, I forward your email to Adam about the lemon balm. So maybe he'll get back to you. Okay, so of course, I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Renfro. I'm the Family Consumer Science Extension Agent here in Washington County. And so I'm going to be talking about the culinary part of herbs. This is going to be very basic, so I won't have all the herbs on here. So if there's a specific one, just send me an email and I'll try to get it to you. So what we're going to kind of go over during my time is when should you actually pick it, how much should you pick, how to wash it, how to store it, fresh versus dried herbs, cooking with herbs, so how to prep it and when to add during cooking processes, the flavors of herbs, and then also what herbs go best in what food dishes. So when is the best time to actually pick your herbs? So if you are purchasing them from the store, you want to purchase them, and you're purchasing them fresh, you want to purchase them just before you actually need to use them. So anywhere from 1 to 3 days beforehand. If you're growing your own, if they are grown outside, so you want to pick them after the dew has dried in the morning, but just before the sun gets too hot. And then also several individuals will grow herbs inside, and if you are growing them in a window, you do want to pick them before the sun gets too hot on those herbs. So one thing is, how much should I pick? Of course, it's going to be based off of what your recipe calls for. And annual herbs, you want to cut them back till they're about 4 inches tall. Perennial herbs, you only want to take about 1/3 of the plant. You also want to choose the smaller leaves since they're a lot more tender and they actually have more flavor. The larger leaves tend to be more bitter. And then also be sure to harvest the bottom leaves before you do the upper leaves. Washing your herbs, if you're going to do a small amount at a time, of course, wash them in cold running water. And then also use a salad spinner if you have a salad spinner to be able to do that. If not, just gently, pat them dry with paper towels. If you're doing a large amount, make sure that you fill a large clean bowl with cool water and swish them around, and then remove them and dump that water again to remove any of that dirt and grime. Refill it with some fresh clean water, and then repeat that process till you don't see any dirt or grime being removed from the herbs. You can also use a salad spinner during this process too. But if you plan on using a lot of herbs and picking a lot of herbs, if you're selling them at the farmer's market or something like that, one good thing that you could do is that you can actually spray them down before you pick them to remove any large debris from them. And then you would use the process of either using a large amount or small amount to wash them. So storing your herbs. So for fresh herbs, you can see the photo on here, an example of a perforated plastic bag. If you don't have access to that, you can actually just use a small storage bag and just make small holes in it. So you can use a knife or a fork or a hole punch just to make those little holes in it. And you can keep it in your refrigerator crisper drawer for up to 3 days. You can also place cut herbs such as cilantro and parsley in a glass jar with water, and then actually cover it with a plastic bag. And you can place that in a refrigerator, and it will last a couple of weeks in the refrigerator that way. Another way that you can also store your herbs is by freezing them. If you do decide to freeze them, it's best that you're going to use them for cooking. And the quality will range anywhere from 2 to 6 months. So making sure that you wash your herbs like recommended before. So one option is to wrap a few sprigs in freezer paper and then place in a freezer bag and seal and freeze, of course. The second option is to cut small pieces, and you can see some of the photos in here. This is something that I actually did as an example so you all can see. I did some rosemary and olive oil. So you can use oil, you can use broth or stock or even water to freeze your herbs in. And so if you do it in oil or stock or broth, you can add, or even water, you can add those to soups or stews or sauces. Of course, if it's like oil or something like that, you would take that amount off of the recipe because you already you're putting extra oil in there. A third option is by making a slurry. So you put the herbs in a food processor with a small amount of water. You pour those into ice cube trays like you do with as you see in the photos also. And you place those, you freeze them. Once they're frozen, you take them out and you pop them out of the ice trays, and they'll be ready for cooking. And also just be sure that you label and date your bag of what is in there. So especially with this, if you plan on using oils or broths or stocks, sometimes they have a color of their own. And as you can see, the oil has frozen an off-white color, and so you may not be able to tell exactly what herbs you have in there. So it's important to label that. And of course, making sure that you put that date on there too. Another option is to dry your herbs. So probably one of the better options, if you have access to that, is using a home dehydrator, or you can do air drying or oven drying. So if you do air drying, the hardier herbs, they're actually easier to dry without a dehydrator. So you can kind of see up here up on top where you can tie them in small bundles and hang them to dry. This will keep for best color and flavor if you dry indoors. For the more tender leaf type herbs, those typically have a higher moisture content and they'll mold if they're not dried quick enough. So it's probably best to do those in a home dryer, but if not, you can also tie them into small bundles and place in a paper bag with holes and hold closed with a rubber band or twine and hang it in an area where there's good air circulation. So anytime that you're doing drying, you want to make sure that it's good air circulation. So one of the other questions that I normally get is fresh versus dried herbs. And so fresh herbs, you actually need, so if a recipe calls for a dried herb and all you have is fresh, you actually need to times that by 3 times. So if a recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of a certain dried herb, you'll actually need to use 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of that fresh herb. And with fresh herbs, you actually have more success in subbing those. Whereas the dried herbs, you don't actually need as much of the dried herbs because you're drawing out that moisture. And so when you draw out that moisture, it actually intensifies the flavor of that herb. So how do you prepare your herbs? So there is a couple of different ways. With minced herbs, usually when a recipe calls for an herb, it's usually minced. So you can use a sharp knife on a cutting board. You can also use kitchen scissors or herb scissors, and you can see an example of that up on top. You can also use, they have the little tool, and you might have seen it in the photo where I showed the freezing and the ice cubes, where you can actually run the herb into that, and it takes off the leaves from it. I've seen where you can also use colanders. You can run it through the holes in the colanders to get that the leaves off those herbs. If you do use a food processor, just be very careful. If you plan on mincing it, it can be easily turned into paste. The more hardier herbs, you can actually just run your finger along the stem of it from top to bottom to take those leaves off. The more tender herbs like cilantro and parsley, it's okay if you use some of the stem with the leaves on there. So when do you actually add your herbs? And so with the more delicate type herbs, so your basil, your mint, your dill, your cilantro, you'll want to add them about 1 to 2 minutes before the end of the cooking, or onto the food before serving. So if it's more of a cold type thing, or if it's just for decoration or something like that. If it's a more less delicate type herb, more like oregano or rosemary or tarragon or thyme, you can do it the last 10 to 20 minutes of that cooking. Dried herbs typically can be added earlier in the cooking process compared to those fresh herbs. Also, if herbs are added to be added to cold foods, you want to do it several hours before to let those flavors incorporate. But if an herb has a very overpowering flavor, just be very mindful as to how long you've actually added in there before. So mint can sometimes overtake a lot of things, the flavors, so just be mindful of that. So some flavors of different herbs. So if you're wanting a more stronger flavor, of course you go with the bay leaf. You'll see bay leaves a lot and used in stews and soups. Mustard, rosemary, sage. If you're wanting a medium flavor, you're going to use more basil, celery seeds and leaves, dill, fennel, French tarragon, marjoram, mint, oregano, savory, and thyme. For a more delicate flavor, you're going to use that Chive, the chives, the parsley. If you're looking for a more sweet flavor, of course, the mint. There's all different kinds of mint. I'm sure Adam can name several of different kinds. And if you're looking for more of a savory type flavor for your dish, you're going to go more for the oregano, the tarragon, the chives, and the dill. So some of the 10 popular herbs that most people will have in their gardens or will use. So for mint, a lot of people will use them in carrots, fruit salads, parsleys, peas, tabbouleh, tea. For dill, they'll use in carrots, cottage cheese, fish, green beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and dips. Basil is more for, they'll use it for tomatoes, making pesto, pasta sauces, peas, and zucchini. Your sage, you're looking more for those poultry seasonings and stuffings. Your rosemary, you use a lot on the chicken, lamb, fish, pork, roasted potatoes, soups, stews, and tomatoes. Thyme, you're going to use on eggs, lima beans, potatoes, poultry, summer squash, tomatoes. The cilantro, Mexican, Asian, and Caribbean cooking, salsas, and tomatoes. And cilantro is one of those that it's kind of 50-50 of people that like it and don't like it. I'm one person that really likes it. I know several people that don't like it because they say it tastes like soap to them. And what it is it's and it's true for about half the population out there. To them, cilantro tastes like soap, and it's just something have to do with the genetics and enzymes and things like that we have for digestion. Chives, so dips, potatoes, and tomatoes. Oregano, we use on peppers and tomatoes. And the parsley, whether it's flat leaf or Italian, we'll use on potato salad and tabbouleh. So I actually put a couple of different recipes on here for you all. So the first recipe, you know, is the tabbouleh recipe, and so this is more of a Mediterranean style dish. This recipe actually comes from the University of Nebraska, and so as you can see, you're using a lot of different fresh foods, and so this is a really good summer type dish. So of course, tomatoes will be in season before too long. Cucumbers, fresh parsley, fresh mint, sliced green onions, so the chives, or a sweet onion, your garlic, your olive oil, and your lemon juice. The other thing that's very popular that people typically make, especially when they grow a lot of basil, is pesto. And so on here, this recipe comes from Texas A&M, and so their recipe calls for walnuts. So if you happen to not have access to pine nuts, you can actually use walnuts, garlic cloves, basil, salt, and you'll see that you need a lot of basil to make pesto, so you need about 4 cups of basil. And so one good way to actually cut basil, if you're not having to do it in a food processor, is taking the leaves and stacking them on top of each other and rolling them really tightly, and doing a chiffonade slice to them, so that you're slicing them into smaller pieces to add to things. The other thing that's on here is an Italian spice blend, so you can actually make your own Italian spice blend. So typically what's in them is basil, oregano, thyme, rosemary, garlic, and then also onions in there. You can store, if you do make your own blends, you can store them in a small canning jar, in a spice jar, or a storage bag. All right. So I was seeing if there was any questions. Okay. So the one question, I'm not sure if this is yours, Adam, but one question is, will following your rejuvenation plan also work for lavender?
It will. And so I did reply back in the group chat, but so lavender, there's a couple different times of year when we can actually prune it. One is about this time of year, again, once the danger of frost or free has passed in the spring. And so we can rejuvenate it then. And in fact, it takes about 3 years for lavender to reach its full size. So it's recommended that that's done at least once every 3 years. You can also cut it back in the summer after it's done flowering. Especially in colder climates, it seems that that's recommended because it helps reduce the size going into winter, and it's less likely to split out with heavy snow loads. So there is some options there as to when you prune it. So if it needs pruning now, if it's very woody, especially if it's older than 3 years, I'd encourage Patty to do that now. And if it's not, then maybe look at it after it blooms this summer.
Another question, probably more along my lines, is there a broth that is better to use, beef versus chicken versus vegetable, or is it all dependent upon what you plan to use the product with? So that just depends on what you are going to use it in. So if your soup or stew is more of a vegetable base, you might want to use a vegetable broth or stock, and same thing with chicken or beef. It's more of a preference of what you want to use it in. And then also wanting to know how long the herbs are frozen in broth will last. Typically, probably around that 6-month mark is how long your herbs will last and that are frozen in the broth. So the thing with the freezing the herbs is, of course, the quality starts going down. If there is a lot of water activity in there, when you freeze something, it actually creates ice crystals, and it bursts the cell walls, and so they just become very limp and don't have a lot of they're just basically very limp. So you're losing a lot of the water from that. But is there any other questions for Adam and myself this evening? Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Of course, you can reach out to Adam and myself if you have any questions. Feel free to visit our website, washington.tennessee.edu, to find our email addresses and or our office phone number to contact us. You can also find us, of course, on Facebook. And hopefully we'll be able to do a few more of these classes held via distant learning, if not hopefully in person soon. I like to do hands-on type things when it comes to. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a good evening.